The air before the Towers of the Teeth did not merely smell of death, it tasted of it. A grey, choking grit hung suspended in the stagnant heat, coating the tongues of men who had marched 100 miles to die. Here, upon the desolate Slag Hills of the Morannon, stood the host of the West, a grand title for a tragic reality. To any student of warfare, the disposition of this army was an insult to logic. Less than 6,000 spears and swords were arranged in a defensive crouch upon 2 mounds of industrial refuse. They had no flanks to turn, no high ground to exploit, and no reserves to call upon. They were a speck of silver and grey, drowning in a sea of brown ash. Behind them lay the barren wastes of the Narcost and Carchost. Before them, the iron gates of the Black Land, shut tight and silent. But the silence was the weapon. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against the chest, designed to break the will before the first arrow was loosed. The men of Rohan and Gondor gripped their shields with white-knuckled desperation, their eyes darting to the black slit of the gate. They knew the tactical truth. They were not here to conquer. They were bait. This was not a formation of war, but an offering, a calculated gamble where the currency was the blood of kings and the flower of the West, wagered on the faintest hope that the Dark Lord's eye would fixate here, and here alone. They stood in the mouth of the trap, daring it to snap shut. This was the opening move of the Battle of the Black Gate. To fully comprehend the sheer madness of the deployment at the Morannon, one must strip away the romance of legend and look at the cold, hard logistical reality. This campaign was not born of military confidence. It was born of desperation. In the aftermath of the Pelennor fields, the captains of the West faced a mathematical certainty. They could not win a conventional war. Sauron's forces, though bruised, were vast and replenishing. The free peoples of Middle-earth were spent. The strategy devised by Aragorn and Gandalf was, in purely tactical terms, a feint. But it was a feint executed with the main force of their remaining strength. The objective was psychological. They had to convince the Dark Lord that a new Ring Lord had arisen, someone arrogant enough, foolish enough, to march on the Black Gate with a pittance of an army, believing the One Ring granted him invincibility. If Sauron believed this, he would empty his lands to crush the pretender and seize the prize. He would look north, ignoring the 2 small hobbits creeping for shadows in the south. The march itself was a grueling exercise in attrition. 7,000 men departed Minas Tirith. They were a composite force, the heavy infantry of Gondor, the riders of Rohan, and the Dunedain of the north. But as they pressed deeper into the ruined lands of Ithilien and approached the desolation of the Morannon, the very air turned against them. The breathlessness was not a metaphor. It was a physical weight of malice that triggered primal dread in the hearts of unblooded soldiers. It is a testament to Aragorn's command style and a stark contrast to the enemy he fought, that he did not execute the men whose courage failed. When the dread became too great for some of the younger farmers and herdsmen of Rohan, he did not brand them cowards. Instead, he detached a force to retake the island fortress of Caer Andros to the west. It was a secondary objective that allowed them to depart with honor, but it left the main host dangerously thin. By the time they reached the Slag Hills, the army of the West numbered scarcely 6,000 men. The terrain they chose for their final stand was the only feature in the landscape that offered a fraction of a defensive advantage. The Morannon, the Black Gate, lay at the narrow neck of a valley formed by the convergence of the Ered Lithui, the Ash Mountains to the north, and the Ephel-Duath, the Mountains of Shadow, to the west. It was a natural funnel, a killbox designed by geology and fortified by dark sorcery. Before the gate lay 2 great mounds of slag industrial waste and tunnel forges of Mordor, hardened into rocky, uneven hills. Aragorn saw the tactical utility in this refuge. On the flat plain, his small force would be instantly enveloped and crushed by the sheer weight of the enemy. But on the hills, they could form tight, defensive rings. The uneven ground would break the momentum of a charge, forcing the enemy to fight uphill. However slightly, it denied the enemy the ability to bring all their numbers to bear at a single moment. He deployed his forces in a dual ring formation. Aragorn, Gandalf, and the banner of the White Tree took the one hill. Eomer, the Rohirrim, and the princes of Dol Amroth took the other. They stood back to back, creating a perimeter of spears and shields, with the short span between the hills serving as a killing ground for any orc foolish enough to try and split them. But the enemy was not merely waiting, they were posturing. Before the first blow was struck, the Black Gate opened, not to release an army, but a single rider, the mouth of Sauron. This parley was a calculated delay. Sauron, ever the deceiver, wanted to probe his enemy. He presented the tokens of Frodo, the mithril coat, the elven cloak, as psychological artillery. The intent was to break the command structure of the West before the battle began, to reveal that their great gamble had already failed.
Why are we stopping?
In a conventional war, seeing the tokens of your
What is
primary
happening?
objective's failure would signal a retreat.
I don't like this.
But Gandalf seized the initiative, rejecting the terms of surrender with a flash of white fire. It was the signal that the deception was over. The trap was sprung. As the mouth of Sauron fled back to the gate, the drums began to roll. From the canyons and the hidden drilled caves behind the Morannon, the true strength of Mordor poured forth. It was not just orcs, it was a combined arms force of terrifying variety. Easterlings, heavily armored and disciplined, moved to flank the Slag Hills. Trolls, the heavy siege engines of biological warfare, lumbered forward to break the shield walls. The numbers were catastrophic. The 6,000 men on the Slag Hills were not just outnumbered, they were effectively surrounded before the first sword was drawn. The logistics of survival had ended. The mechanics of slaughter were about to begin. The trap did not merely spring, it exploded. The gates of the Morannon swung wide, clashing against the iron stops with a boom that rolled like thunder down the valley of the Udon. And from that dark throat, the armies of the Black Tower vomited forth. It was a tide of iron and malice. It was immediately apparent to every captain on the Slag Hills that the enemy had been holding back the bulk of their strength, waiting for the fly to land deep within the web. The strategy of the enemy was not subtle, it was a brutal, encircling envelopment. From the gate itself poured the orcs of the Eye, a chaotic, screeching flood designed to pin the front. But from the concealed canyons on the flanks, behind the hills of Slag, marched the Easterlings and the Southrons. These were not the mindless rabble of the pits. The Easterlings were men of war, clad in burnished brass and scarlet, wielding tall pikes and scimitars, moved with a discipline that rivaled the Gondorians, forming solid blocks of infantry that began to close the pincers around the two smaller hills. The army of the West was now an island, the grey sea of Slag rapidly disappearing beneath a rising tide of black and red. The initial collision was deafening. There was no room for maneuver, no space for the Rohirrim to charge. The horses were kept in the center of the defensive rings, trembling as the smell of troll flesh and predator musk washed over them. The outer perimeter was a wall of locking shields, Gondorian steel meshed with the round, painted shields of Rohan. They held their ground on the slopes, forcing the enemy to scramble up the loose, shifting scree of the slag mounds. For the first hour, the topography saved them. The loose footing robbed the orcs their momentum. They scrambled up the slopes, only to be met by the downward thrust of spear and sword. The line held, but it was a flexible, breathing thing, bending inward under the sheer weight of numbers, then snapping back as men stepped forward to fill the gaps left by the fallen. Then Sauron played his heavy infantry. From the press of the orcs emerged the Uruk-hai, the great hill trolls of Gorgoroth, These were not the sun-fearing stone trolls of the wild. These were war-bred beasts, towering over men, encased in close-fitting mesh of horny scales and plate armor. They carried hammers the size of anvils and shields of black iron. They did not scramble up the slopes. They smashed through them. The impact of the troll charge against the northern ring was catastrophic. The shield wall, which had held against thousands of orcs, shattered under the kinetic force of the trolls. Men were not merely killed, they were obliterated, thrown like rag dolls into the center of the press. Panic, cold and sharp, began to fray the edges of the defense. It was in this chaos, amidst the screaming of horses and the grinding of steel, that the war was distilled down to a single, desperate vignette. On the forward slope, Baragorn of the Guard stood his ground, a lone figure of silver against a towering nightmare. A troll chief, greater than the rest, crashed through the line, its hide impervious to the biting swords of the soldiers. It struck Baragorn down, standing over him with a slavering hunger, ready to tear the life from his throat. And there, the impossible happened. Not a prince, not a wizard, but a halfling intervened. Pippin Took, a small figure in the livery of the tower, moved not with the training of a soldier, but with the frantic courage of a friend. He saw the beast, the horror that froze the blood of veteran killers, and he lunged. His blade, Barrow Blade of Westerness, wound with spells for the destruction of Mordor, pierced the troll's hide. The beast screamed a sound that cut through the din of battle and collapsed, burying the hobbit beneath its suffocating, reeking bulk. It was a microscopic victory in a losing war, a testament that even here, at the end of all things, the small could still sting the great. But courage alone cannot stop mathematics. The perimeter was shrinking. The Easterlings had closed the circle completely. There was no retreat, no path to the rear. The air above them darkened, not just with the gloom of Mordor, but with wings. The Nazgul had arrived. They descended like shrikes, the remaining 8, their screeches stripping the minds of the defenders bare. This was the true weapon of the enemy, the Black Breath. Men dropped their swords, their hands trembling uncontrollably, their wills vaporized by the proximity of the ring wraiths. The captains, Aragorn, Eomer, Imrahil, rode back and forth, shouting above the din, holding the line together by the sheer force of their presence. But they were exhausted. The sun was hidden. The end was not coming. It was here. And then the wind changed. A cry went up, not from the ground, but from the sky. The eagles are coming. It was a shift in the atmospheric pressure of the battle. Down from the north, riding the currents of the wind, came Gwaihir, the Wind Lord, and the vassals of the northern mountains. They did not strike the armies below. They struck the air war. They collided with the Nazgul, beak against fell beast, a storm of feathers and shrieks that tore the sky apart. For a fleeting second, the soldiers on the ground looked up, the oppressive weight of the Nazgul lifting just enough for them to draw a breath. But the true climax was not happening in the sky, nor on the Slag Hills. It was happening miles away, in the heart of the fire. Suddenly, the rhythm of the battle broke. It was not a sound, but a silence. A shudder ran through the earth, a deep tectonic groan that vibrated through the boots of every soldier, friend and foe alike. The orcs halted, their weapons raised but frozen. The Easterlings looked to the Black Tower, their eyes wide with a sudden dawning comprehension of disaster. The will that drove them, the singular dominating consciousness that held this vast army of disparate hatreds together, vanished. It was as if a puppet master had dropped the strings. The orcs, stripped of the driving force of Sauron, became mindless, terrified creatures. They aimlessly collided with one another, their formation dissolving into a mob of quivering panic. The trolls, no longer directed by a dark intelligence, became confused beasts, lashing out blindly or stumbling into the wastes. Then came the visual apocalypse. The Towers of the Teeth, those ancient sentinels of the pass, began to sway. The Black Gate crumbled, the iron warping as the foundations of the earth heaved. And in the distance, high above the dark plain of Gorgoroth, a shadow rose vast, impenetrable, crowned with lightning. It reached out a colossal hand toward the west, a final grasp of malice, before a great wind took it and blew it away, dissolving it into nothingness. The connection was severed. The army of Mordor, moments ago an unstoppable machine, was now a scattered flock before a wolf. The men of the West, though weary to the point of collapse, saw the fear in the eyes of their enemies. The Easterlings, seeing their god fall, cast down their weapons or fled into the shadows. The orcs scattered like dust in a gale. The gamble had paid out. The bait had survived the trap. The ring was gone. And with it, the age of the Dark Lord was extinguished in a single catastrophic heartbeat. When the shadow finally lifted from the Morannon, it revealed a landscape transformed. The Slag Hills, once the anvil upon which the West was to be broken, stood silent. The great iron gate lay twisted, a piece of wreckage from a forgotten age. But the true transformation was not in the geography of the battlefield, but in the soul of the world itself. The victory at the Black Gate was absolute, yet it was unlike any triumph recorded in the annals of Gondor or Arnor. There were no spoils of war to gather, no lands to annex from the vanquished. The realm of Sauron simply ceased to be. The orcs were scattered to the dark corners of the earth, never again to rise as a great power. The Southrons and Easterlings, seeing the lie of their god exposed, sued for peace. The king Elessa granted it, and this was the first act of the New Age, a peace built not on subjugation, but on mercy, a concept alien to the enemy they had just defeated. But the cost of this victory was not paid in gold, nor fully in the blood of soldiers. Though many brave men lay dead upon the ash, the true price was paid in the passing of magic. The destruction of the ring was the unmaking of the ancient world. With the fall of Barad-dûr, the three rings of the elves lost their power. The preservation of Lothlorien and Rivendell failed. The time of the firstborn was over. The dominion of men had begun. This transition was the final, bittersweet fruit of the battle. To save Middle-earth, the elves and the wizards had to engineer their own obsolescence. They fought to preserve a world that would no longer have a place for them. As the army of the West returned to the White City, shining in the sun, the High Elves began their quiet, grey pilgrimage to the Grey Havens. They left behind a world that was safer, yes, but also smaller. Less perilous, but less wondrous. And at the center of this great geopolitical shift lay the smallest of figures, the ring-bearer. While the captains were hailed as heroes, Frodo Baggins bore wounds that no physical peace could heal. He had carried the weight of the world's malice, and though he survived the fire of Mount Doom, he did not return untouched. His sacrifice underscores the profound military and philosophical truth of the War of the Ring, that some victories are so total they consume the victor. He saved the Shire, but not for himself. The Battle of the Black Gate stands as a singular anomaly in the history of warfare. It was a battle designed not to be won, but to be endured. It was a tactical suicide mission that succeeded only because it relied on the one variable the enemy could not comprehend: self-sacrifice. It proved that in the end, the shadow was not defeated by the strength of the sword, nor the height of the wall, nor the might of the army. It was defeated by two halflings walking into the dark, and a few thousand men willing to stand at the end of the world and hold the line for just one moment longer.